Some names were written to cross oceans long before we ever knew they would. Every soul that enters this world comes already aware of the trials it must walk through, the pain it must endure, and the wisdom it must gather along the way. These souls arrive carrying both their suffering and their strength, already chosen to leave behind a powerful knowledge that will outlive the body. One of those names, etched in the unseen before it was ever spoken aloud, is Mohammad Kaba Saganugu, a man taken from his land, bound in chains, yet destined to leave behind words that no ocean could drown. This is not a story of being forgotten. This is a story of a man whose life was bent beneath chains, yet whose voice still reached beyond them. A man who answered the silence forced upon him with ink, turning his suffering into testimony. In Jamaica, at the very moment the last doors of slavery began to open, he gathered the remnants of his strength and sent forth words in the language of his faith. He was not a prophet, not a ruler, not a man history was meant to remember. Yet his name rose above the fields, above the mountains, above the ocean itself. His story reminds us, what Allah writes cannot be erased. He was born in West Africa in the 1700s, where the rhythm of the Qur'an shaped his earliest years as much as the care of his family. At dawn, young men and boys rose together, rubbing sleep from their eyes as the call to prayer wove through the morning air. They washed at the wells, small hands splashing water across their faces, laughing at the chill, before lining up to pray beside their fathers. When lessons began, they sat cross-legged by fire pits and lanterns, tracing Arabic letters into the dust, their voices rising in unison as they recited words older than the earth itself. Outside the madrasa, he was not only a student, he was a son. The kind of son whose laughter filled a courtyard, whose footsteps carried water for the household, whose presence was joy before it was duty. And when the sun went down, his mother's care wrapped around him like a shelter. The night was softened by her nearness, her presence guarding his sleep as surely as the stars kept watch above. He was a child wrapped in belonging, shaped by devotion, and sheltered in a faith that already knew him as its own. But the world that cradled him did not remain. In 1777, Mohammad Kaba Saganugu was seized and dragged toward the coast, bound for a ship whose wooden belly would swallow him whole. He did not give us the details of that moment, only the truth. He was kidnapped, and he was enslaved. His silence speaks its own kind of truth. Some wounds are carried in the heart, unspoken, because words could never hold them. Some men heal by describing every detail, and others by entrusting their grief to Allah. Kaba was the latter. He gave us the fact, but not the image. Still, we know from countless other voices what those kidnappings look like. Villages raided at night, children torn from their mothers, elders slaughtered, young men bound in chains. The sound of wailing rising over huts set ablaze. Though he spared us the memory, we know that what he endured was terror itself. His silence was not denial, it was trust in Allah, who knew every lash, every tear, every prayer said in chains. From the moment he was taken, his life was forced into a darkness that countless others described, even if he himself left it unsaid. He did not give us the story of the ship, but history fills the silence. Shackled in rows beneath the deck, men and women lay pressed against one another, the stench of blood and waste choking the air. The cries of children echoed through the hold, mixing with the groans of the dying. Salt water burned open wounds as chains cut deeper into skin. There was no escape, no weapon, no way to fight back. Only the slow breaking of the body and the heavier breaking of the heart. The greatest sorrow was not just the pain, but the helplessness. The knowledge that he could not free himself, could not protect the others, could only endure what was written for him. It was the sadness of having to accept a fate already sealed. The dark voyage across the Atlantic was not a journey, but a nightmare stretched over waves. Many would never touch land again, their bodies surrendered to the sea. But Mohammad Kaba Saganugu endured. And though he did not speak of the voyage, he carried what no chains could strip away. The verses of the Qur'an he had learned as a youth in West Africa, whispered in the silence of his heart. He crossed the ocean with grief on his shoulders and Allah on his tongue, stepping into Jamaica, not as a free man of his homeland, but as an enslaved man who had already survived the abyss. When the ocean finally released him, it was not to freedom, but to another kind of cage. Jamaica became the ground of his bondage. Mohammad Kaba Saganugu was taken to the Spice Grove Coffee Estate in Manchester Parish, high in the hills west of Mandeville. There the mountains looked peaceful, but the land was soaked in sweat. Every morning, the enslaved were driven into the fields under the weight of overseers' eyes, their bodies bent to the rhythm of labor that never ended. Kaba would live the rest of his life under that system, stripped of his homeland, stripped of his name. The planters tried to rename him Dick, then later Robert Pert, after his master, and even Robert Tuffet in baptismal records. But a man's soul cannot be renamed. Behind every forced title, his true name lived on, Mohammad Kaba Saganugu, servant of Allah. And though he never wrote of the daily grind of plantation life, we know he never abandoned his faith. The strength of his Islam carried him through the long years. If he could preserve his literacy in Arabic and write about prayer and patience decades later, then we can trust that he stayed in touch with Allah through every trial. His patience and quiet endurance were proof enough that his heart remained firm in belief. Decades into his bondage, Mohammad Kaba Saganugu did something almost unthinkable for a man in chains, he wrote. Between 1820 and 1823, on the Spice Grove estate, he composed a manuscript of nearly 50 folios in Arabic. It was not a diary of his wounds, but a torch for his people. He carried across the ocean not just the memory of home, but the knowledge of Islam. And when many forgot, he remembered. When many could not write, he put ink to paper. It was as if Allah himself preserved him so that the faith would not be erased from Jamaica. In his manuscript, he reminded a community of Muslim men and women of the essentials that no slave master could take. Prayer, salah. He explained how to pray. The washing, the standing, the bowing, the recitation. Because prayer is not just ritual, it is the rope that ties a believer to Allah. Even when freedom was stolen, even when names were stolen, prayer could not be stolen. By holding to prayer, he and those who listened to him declared, "We still belong to Allah." Marriage, nikah. He spoke of marriage as protection. In slavery, people were treated like property, but marriage reminded them they were still human beings before Allah. It preserved honor and dignity, created families rooted in faith, and shielded men and women from being consumed by a world that tried to strip them of both choice and respect. Marriage was more than a union. It was survival for the soul. Purification, tahara. He taught the laws of washing and cleansing, because to purify the body was to remind the heart it still belonged to Allah. Perhaps when the dirt of the fields covered him, he remembered, "I can still wash I can still stand clean before my Lord. Purification became an act of resistance, a way to say, I am not what slavery makes me. I am who Allah created me to be. Fasting. He instructed on fasting, the discipline that makes the soul master the body. In a place where enslaved people often had no control over their time, their food, their very breath, fasting was a way of reclaiming power through obedience to Allah. Patience. And above all, he wrote of patience. Decades of bondage did not silence him because Allah gave him patience as a shield. His manuscript carried patience not as weakness, but as strength, the strength to remember who you are when the world insists you are nothing. Through these teachings, he was not only writing rules, he was writing survival. He was preaching to the next generation. Do not forget who you are. Do not forget who you belong to. Remember Allah, for He remembers you. And Allah was with him. From the moment he was taken in 1777, to the long years on Spice Grove, to the day he walked free, Allah never left him. He was stripped of his homeland, his freedom, and even his name. But when emancipation came in 1838, he still had his faith, he still had his Arabic, and he still had his identity as a Muslim intact. Many did not live to see freedom. Many died without their done. But Mohammad Kaba Saganugu was chosen by Allah to be seen, to be heard, and to leave behind his testimony. The Qur'an says, indeed, those who have said, Our Lord is Allah, and then remained steadfast, the angels will descend upon them, saying, Do not fear and do not grieve, but receive good tidings of paradise which you were promised. Qur'an 41:30. In 1838, after more than 60 years in bondage, Mohammad Kaba Saganugu stood as a free man. Old, worn, and scarred by a lifetime of slavery, yet unbroken in faith. At the very moment when Britain declared full emancipation across Jamaica, Kaba did something extraordinary. He wrote. With the same hand that had once traced Quranic letters as a child, with the same knowledge he had carried across an ocean, he composed an address in Arabic Ajam and sent it to the governor of Jamaica, Sir Lionel Smith. In his address, Kaba did not tell stories of revenge or bitterness. Instead, he remembered his kidnapping in 1777. He remembered the sorrow of enslavement, and he remembered the decades that tested him. But above all, he turned his words toward Allah. His letter carried grief, yes, but it also carried gratitude. Gratitude for having lived to see the day when chains were removed. Gratitude for being counted among those freed not only in body, but free in done. After half a century of forced labor on the Spice Grove estate, after losing his homeland, after being renamed again and again, he wrote to say, I survived, I endured, and I am still Muslim. His voice was not just for the governor, it was for history, for us. The Qur'an says, And we willed to favor those who were oppressed in the land, and make them leaders and inheritors. Qur'an 28:5. On that day, Kaba stood among those who were once crushed, but had risen again, inheritors of their faith, proof that Allah's promise never fails. After emancipation, Mohammad Kaba Saganugu lived out the last years of his life as a free elder in the hills of Manchester Parish. The chains that had bound his youth and middle age no longer marked his days. He was still poor, still carrying the scars of enslavement, but he was free. And more than that, he was free with his deen intact. He still bore his true name, still wrote in the language of Islam, and still stood as a witness to the power of Allah's preservation. In 1845, Kaba passed away in Jamaica. He died far from the land of his birth, far from the village where his youth was spent in Qur'anic learning. Yet he died as he had lived, a Muslim, a man of knowledge, and a man whose faith endured longer than any empire. He did not choose his captivity, but Allah chose him to carry Islam across an ocean and leave behind testimony that would outlive him. His life is not only history, it is a mirror for us today. We complain of our hardships, our struggles in a world of distraction and temptation. Yet this man endured 60 years of slavery, the lash of the overseer, the silence of chains, and still never let go of Allah. He prayed, he taught, he wrote, he endured. So what is our excuse? If Mohammad Kaba could hold on to his dine in the belly of slavery, then surely we can hold on to ours in the freedom Allah has given us today. His story reminds us that patience is power, remembrance is survival, and that no force on earth can take faith from a heart that Allah has preserved. The Qur'an says, "Indeed, Allah does not allow to be lost the reward of those who endure with excellence." Qur'an 11:11-5. Muhammad Kaba endured, and through him Allah gave us a witness. May we endure as he endured, and may our hearts remain as steadfast as his.